Unaware his wife was the billionaire funding his contract, he signed everything over to his mistress. What happened next ruined him completely. He didn't just betray her once, he erased her. Daniel Carter thought the moment he signed those papers, he'd finally cut himself free from caution, from doubt, from the woman who had quietly stood behind him while the world applauded him. He believed success came from boldness, from choosing the louder voice, from replacing patience with praise. So when the funding email disappeared, when payroll failed, when his phone stopped ringing, Daniel didn't panic. Not at first. Men like him never do. He laughed, called it a glitch, blamed systems, blamed timing, blamed everyone except the woman sleeping in the next room who had quietly paid for every win he ever celebrated. What Daniel didn't know was that the contracts he bragged about were never really his. The money he trusted wasn't loyal to him. And the woman he dismissed as too small had designed a world where betrayal didn't explode at closed doors, quietly. While Daniel chased validation through late-night calls and flattery from a woman who admired his reflection more than his character, Evelyn Carter sat in silence, watching dashboards only she and her trustee could see. She didn't scream. She didn't confront. She let cruelty expose itself. Because the most wicked revenge isn't loud. It's letting someone destroy themselves with their own signature. Years earlier, when the very first funding agreement for Daniel's company was drafted, Evelyn had insisted on protections no one in his world ever bothered to read twice. Reversion clauses, control triggers, conditions tied to trust and loyalty. They were buried in the back pages, wrapped in legal language, signed by Daniel in the rush to get started. He never asked why they were there. He never asked who they protected. By the time Daniel realized the money had stopped answering him, the mistress had already stepped away. The lawyer had already turned pale, and the final clause written long before Lydia ever appeared was already awake. He thought he was choosing freedom. He was choosing collapse. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. If you watch without subscribing, it's like letting Evelyn's silence go unheard. When you subscribe, you stand with every person who was underestimated, erased, and betrayed, then prove that dignity is the most dangerous weapon of all. Like, share, and comment the lesson that stayed with you. Tell me where you're watching from. The first big contract came through at midnight. Daniel Carter stared at his phone, breath caught in his chest, as the notification refreshed again and again. Approved, a six-figure deal, his biggest yet. He let out a sharp laugh, the kind that came from disbelief mixed with pride, and turned toward the woman standing quietly a few steps behind him. Evelyn, he said, voice shaking with excitement. This changes everything. Evelyn Carter smiled, but softly, always softly. She had learned long ago that loud joy invited questions, and questions were dangerous. Evelyn was 34, calm in a way that made people underestimate her. She dressed simply, spoke carefully, and never corrected anyone when they assumed she lived an ordinary life. To the world, she was just the wife of an ambitious contractor trying to build something from nothing. But years before Daniel ever signed his first deal, Evelyn had already owned more than most people would ever see. She was 26 when her parents died within months of each other. The grief left behind something else too, an empire no one talked about publicly. Her family had owned a private investment firm that specialized in quiet acquisitions and long-term stakes. When the firm was sold, the payout was staggering, well into billionaire territory once everything was totaled. Evelyn inherited everything. The money didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with lawyers, locked rooms, and silence. She learned quickly that wealth changed how people looked at her, how they spoke, how they loved. So she made a decision that shaped the rest of her life. She placed every cent into blind trusts, structures designed to protect assets and identities. The trusts invested through a discreet corporate trustee, Miller Advisory Holdings, that appeared on paperwork instead of her own name. And she chose one person to manage them, Grace Miller. Grace was in her late 50s, sharp-eyed and steady, and had worked with Evelyn's parents for decades. She wasn't just a trustee, she was a shield, a woman who understood discretion the way others understood ambition. Your life doesn't need to shrink because of this, Grace had told her, but it does need to be protected. When Evelyn met Daniel 2 years later, she didn't tell him any of that. Daniel was 36 then, confident, driven, always talking about the future. He worked long hours, believed deeply in effort and reward, and talked about success as if it were a mountain he could climb if he just moved fast enough. Evelyn liked that about him. He believed in building. But she had already learned the cost of being chosen for the wrong reasons. She didn't hide her wealth to test Daniel. She hid it because she wanted something real. So when Daniel asked about money early in their relationship, she smiled and said, "I'm comfortable." When he suggested combining finances, she gently refused. "Separate is peaceful," she said. "Less pressure." Daniel shrugged. He liked her independence. Before they married, her lawyers insisted on a clean prenuptial agreement. Her inherited assets and the trust that invested in his business would always stay separate, no matter what happened between them. Daniel signed it quickly. He was in love, and the only line he really cared about was the one that made them husband and wife. It made him feel like he wasn't being taken care of. What he never questioned was how his early contracts kept working out. The first time an investor backed out at the last minute, another one appeared quietly, efficiently, with better terms. When his credit fell short, approvals still came through. When bids should have failed, they didn't. Behind the scenes, Evelyn made one call every time. To Grace. Grace handled the rest. The funding came through a shell investment group, Miller Advisory Holdings, acting for an unnamed trust that couldn't be traced back to Evelyn on any basic search. The paperwork was clean, legal, standard for private capital. Evelyn never attended meetings, never signed in person, never asked for recognition. She only asked one thing. Every time Daniel brought home a contract, excitement buzzing in his voice, Evelyn would read it carefully. Then she would look up and ask, almost casually, "Is this protected if things change?" Daniel always laughed. "You worry too much." He remembered that Grace's office, introduced to him as a discreet private fund, had already reviewed everything with his lawyer, Paul, years earlier. He treated it as background noise. She never argued. She just nodded and quietly checked with Grace that the clauses she'd insisted on were still in every deal. Investor control, reversion rights, strict conditions if Daniel ever tried to move the company away from its original protections. That night, Daniel opened a bottle of cheap champagne in their kitchen, celebrating his latest win. He talked about expansion, about reputation, about finally being taken seriously. Evelyn listened. Watched the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about himself. She loved him, quietly, completely. She loved him enough to stay invisible. As Daniel talked, his phone buzzed again. Another email, another confirmation. He raised his glass, pride swelling. "This is just the beginning," he said. Evelyn lifted her glass too, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere to the trusts, the clauses, the protections she had insisted on years ago. Not because she planned for betrayal, but because she believed love didn't mean blindness. Grace's name appeared briefly on Evelyn's phone screen. A simple message. All structures stable. Funding routed as agreed. Evelyn slipped the phone away. Daniel turned toward her, smiling wide, unaware of how much of that smile rested on foundations he had never seen. As he talked about the future, Evelyn studied him. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with something closer to hope. Hope that he would never give her a reason to step out of the shadows. When Daniel finally laughed and pulled her into a brief, distracted embrace, Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder and whispered so softly he didn't hear it. "I hope you never forget who helped you stand." Daniel raised his glass again, celebrating his success. And somewhere deep beneath the contracts and the smiles, something quiet shifted unnoticed, waiting. In the next months, Daniel would step into rooms Evelyn was never invited to, and doors once opened in silence would begin to close just as quietly. The applause came before Daniel even finished speaking. He stood at the front of the conference room, shoulders back, voice confident, watching faces nod as his presentation ended. A moment later, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He didn't need to look to know what it was. Another approval, another win. Daniel Carter smiled like a man who had finally proven something to the room, to his past, to himself. "This is just the beginning," he said, soaking in the attention. Across the room, Mark Reynolds, his business partner, leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a grin. Mark was a few years older than Daniel, practical and cautious by nature, the kind of man who checked numbers twice and trusted optimism once. After the meeting, Mark clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Man," he said, half joking, half serious, "it's like someone upstairs wants you to win." Daniel laughed loudly. "I told you," Hard work, timing, skill. He didn't mention Evelyn. He didn't think to. Over the next few weeks, the pace became unreal. Bids Daniel submitted late at night were approved by morning. Investors who hesitated were replaced within hours by the same anonymous fund, Miller Advisory Holdings. Quiet, efficient, never asking for meetings or credit. Mark noticed. "Have you ever met them?" he asked once. "This fund? Miller?" Daniel shrugged. "My lawyer does. They prefer to stay in the background. It's normal with private money." It was true. Years earlier, Paul had explained that some families invested through trusts in corporate names and never appeared in person. Daniel had nodded, signed where he was told, and focused only on the word approved. At home, Evelyn noticed something else. Daniel stopped bringing contracts to the kitchen table. He used to sit across from her, papers spread out, asking what she thought. Now, documents stayed in his briefcase. Decisions were made before she knew they existed. When Evelyn raised concerns about growth moving too fast, about long-term risk, Daniel waved them away. "You worry too much," he said, smiling like it was affection. This is how momentum works. The words stung more than she expected. At night, Daniel talked about expansion, about reputation, about how people finally respected him. He said "my company" when he spoke about the future, not our future. Evelyn listened, nodding, asking fewer questions. Not because she didn't care, but because she felt the distance growing, thin at first, then undeniable. One evening, Daniel rushed out the door for a late meeting. Evelyn watched him from the window as he checked his phone, distracted, energized. Her own phone buzzed softly moments later. A message from Grace Miller. They met the next morning in a quiet office that didn't carry Grace's name on the door. Grace sat across from Evelyn, calm as ever, hands folded neatly. "You look tired," Grace said. Evelyn didn't deny it. "I need to ask you something," Evelyn said, her voice steady but low. "If someone betrays the trust we built around him, if he acts against the structure." Grace met her eyes. No surprise there. "The contracts still protect the source," Grace said simply. "They always have. The trust can withdraw or revert control if the conditions are broken." Evelyn exhaled slowly. Not relief, not fear, just understanding. She remembered insisting on those clauses years ago, the long meetings, the quiet arguments with lawyers who thought she was being overly cautious. She hadn't been planning revenge. She had been planning survival. Back at the office, Daniel's confidence grew sharper. He spoke over Mark in meetings now. He dismissed concerns about sustainability. "This is my vision," he said. "You either keep up or you get out of the way." Mark said nothing, but he noticed. That afternoon, Daniel received an email marked private invitation, a networking event, exclusive, invitation only, high-level investors and consultants. Daniel's name was listed alone. When he mentioned it at home, he didn't even look up from his phone. "It's a big deal," he said. "Not really your scene." The words landed quietly. He didn't hear the silence that followed. Evelyn smiled faintly. Of course. She watched him leave again, confident, unaware of the invisible hands that had lifted him so far. Later that night, while Daniel slept, Evelyn sat alone, scrolling through financial dashboards only she and Grace could access. Everything still flowed through the same channels. Everything still led back to her trusts. For now. She closed the screen, her reflection staring back at her in the dark glass. Evelyn didn't feel angry. She felt unseen. And somewhere between Daniel's growing pride and her growing silence, the balance they once shared shifted just enough for something else to step in. As Daniel prepared for a world that didn't include her, Evelyn sensed that the doors opening for him were leading somewhere dangerous. Soon, someone new would walk into those rooms, and Daniel would mistake admiration for loyalty. The first message came in after midnight. Daniel Carter's phone lit up on the bedside table, bright enough to cut through the dark. He reached for it quickly, careful not to wake Evelyn, his thumb moving with a practiced ease that felt too familiar for something so new. "Lydia Moore, great meeting tonight. You handled that room like a natural leader." Daniel smiled to himself. Lydia Moore was 32, sharp, confident, and newly contracted as a business consultant for Daniel's growing company. She came recommended from the exclusive networking circle he had recently been invited into. On paper, her role was simple strategy, growth planning, investor alignment, From the first meeting, her attention had been fixed entirely on Daniel. "You're different," she had told him that night, leaning back in her chair, studying him like a project she already owned. "Most men at your level didn't build it themselves. You did." Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't mention that without a silent funder, the company wouldn't exist at all. He liked the way she said you. Lydia spoke quickly, confidently, always just a little closer than necessary. She asked questions that made Daniel feel seen about his vision, his frustrations, his ambition, and she listened in a way that felt rare, especially compared to home. At home, Evelyn listened too, but she asked questions about risks, about sustainability, about consequences. Lydia asked about legacy. The difference mattered. Over the next week, messages came more often. Short at first, professional, then warmer. Late-night texts about meetings that ran long. Laughing calls Daniel took outside, pacing the quiet street while Evelyn lay awake inside, staring at the ceiling. Evelyn noticed everything. She noticed how Daniel angled his phone away, how he smiled at messages he didn't share, how his tone changed when he said Lydia's name light, almost eager. Still, Evelyn said nothing. She had learned long ago that confrontation without certainty only created lies. One evening, Lydia joined Daniel for a video call from their living room. Evelyn was in the kitchen, pretending to read, when Lydia's face appeared on the screen. Lydia was polished, perfect posture, smooth voice, eyes that never wavered. "Daniel," she said warmly, "I've been reviewing your numbers. Honestly, you're wasted potential." Daniel laughed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Lydia continued, lowering her voice slightly, "you're carrying people who don't understand your scale." Evelyn looked up. Lydia's gaze flicked briefly past the camera, noticing Evelyn for the first time. She smiled tight, measured. "I just wonder," Lydia said casually, "why someone with your drive stays so small." Daniel gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Evelyn likes everything small. Small risks, small circle, small life. She'd rather I play safe than play big." Lydia's lips curved. "Then maybe you've outgrown the life she wants." The word lingered. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't disagree either. Later that night, Evelyn asked gently, "She seems confident." Daniel shrugged. "She's just helping me grow." Evelyn nodded. "Of course." Inside, something quiet shifted again. Days passed, then weeks. Lydia's influence grew. She began suggesting changes, new advisors, new structures, new priorities. She questioned Evelyn's role openly now. "Does she really support your vision?" Lydia asked once, over speakerphone, unaware Evelyn was nearby. Daniel hesitated. "Support doesn't always mean holding you back," Lydia continued smoothly. "Some people are just meant to be left behind." The words landed hard. Evelyn stood frozen in the hallway, listening. She didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't interrupt. When the call ended, Daniel didn't notice her standing there. Evelyn walked into the bedroom without a sound. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she opened the secure financial dashboard, one she hadn't checked personally in weeks. Grace usually handled everything, but instinct pulled her now. As the screen loaded, Evelyn felt a tightness in her chest she couldn't name. Then she saw it. Document access request pending approval. User. External legal consultant linked entity. Carter Strategic Projects Limited. Daniel's company. Purpose. Structural review. Ownership restructuring. Evelyn stared at the screen. She hadn't authorized any change. Grace hadn't mentioned it. The only way an external consultant could be requesting core documents from the funding structure was if someone on Daniel's side had invited them in. Someone like Lydia. Another request appeared beneath it, and another. Not withdrawals, not transfers. Something else. Due diligence packs, shareholder agreements, security documents, everything tied to the trust that quietly backed Daniel's business. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her reflection faint in the dark glass of the screen. For the first time since meeting Daniel, she didn't feel unseen. She felt warned. Behind her, Daniel slept peacefully. And somewhere between ambition and admiration, something far more dangerous had just stepped into their marriage. In the next days, a new structure would be suggested, and a signature would quietly begin to unravel everything she had built around him. The pen hit the paper with a sharp, final sound. Daniel Carter barely noticed it. He was standing in a glass-walled conference room, city reflections bouncing off the windows, his pulse high with confidence. The documents lay spread across the table, thick and official, the kind that made people feel powerful just by touching them. "This is standard," Paul Henderson said calmly. Paul was Daniel's lawyer, mid-40s, polished, efficient, someone Daniel trusted because Paul never sounded unsure. He had handled Daniel's contract since the early days, when the first funding came from the anonymous Miller Advisory Holdings Trust. Beside Daniel stood Lydia Moore, arms folded, expression warm and encouraging. She nodded as Paul spoke, her confidence filling the room. "It's about efficiency," Lydia added smoothly. "You're growing fast. You need cleaner control." On the top page, the new structure was laid out clearly enough. Daniel's shares and project contracts would be transferred into a new holding company, Carter Strategic Projects Limited. Lydia would be appointed as managing director with authority to sign on the company's behalf. Daniel's personal interest would be defined in a way that kept it separate from his marital assets. "Right now," Lydia said, leaning closer, "your wife can complicate everything if things go south. This removes that risk. We move the business out of the marriage. No drama, no arguments." Daniel flipped through the pages quickly. Numbers, legal terms, diagrams showing arrows from his old company into the new one. At the back, in smaller print, were references Paul barely pointed at. "This holding company remains subject to existing security and funding arrangements, as set out in the original Miller advisory agreements," Paul said, tapping the paragraph. "We're not changing your primary investor, just how you hold your stake." Lydia's voice slipped in over his shoulder. "This isn't emotional. It's practical. You can't keep tying your future to someone who doesn't understand where you're going." Over the past weeks, Lydia had been careful, patient. She never insulted Evelyn directly. She just asked questions. "Why does your wife insist on separate finances? Why does she need an advisor involved in everything? Why does she worry about protection instead of growth? You're carrying weight that isn't helping you," Lydia said now. "Emotionally and legally." Paul adjusted his glasses. "This restructuring simplifies ownership. It protects you from interference in the event of a marital dispute. Your existing agreements with the fund remain in place, including all conditions you signed at the start." Daniel hesitated for half a second. He dimly remembered those old documents. Long meetings. Paul and some trustee from Miller Advisory walking him through terms about reversion rights and marital conduct. He'd been so focused on finally getting funding that he hadn't cared. He signed because he needed the money. He told himself Lydia was right. He told himself he deserved to put himself first now. At home, Evelyn felt the shift before she understood it. Her phone buzzed once. She was sitting alone at the kitchen table, laptop open, the trust dashboard already pulled up from the night before. The notification was brief, clinical, event logged, structural change filed entity, Carter Strategic Projects Limited status. Under review funding conditions, check. Evelyn's breath stilled. Back in the conference room, Paul slid the final page forward. "Sign here to transfer your interests. This also reconfirms your acceptance of the original funding conditions." He paused. "Including the personal conduct clause we discussed years ago." Daniel nodded impatiently. "Nothing in my personal life is a problem." He didn't mention Lydia. He didn't admit that Thomas or anyone else could ever prove otherwise. The pen moved again. As the ink dried, Daniel felt strangely lighter, as if he'd finally cut himself free from Evelyn's constant questions and quiet caution. With that single motion, Daniel signed away his wife's informal moral claim to the company and handed Lydia formal control in day-to-day operations on paper. At the same time, he reaffirmed the old funding agreements he had never really read. Buried deep in those original contracts, now carried forward into this restructure were protections Evelyn had insisted on. A reversion clause, funding authority tied permanently to the original investor's trust. A condition that if the primary beneficiary of the company breached marital trust, the investor could withdraw funding and take back control of the secured assets. Evelyn didn't see the signatures, but she saw the consequence. At home, her dashboard refreshed. A line of text appeared. "Trigger window, open conduct review permitted under clause 14. She closed her laptop slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't confront Daniel when he walked through the door later that evening, energized, distracted, talking about streamlining, freedom, and how Lydia understood the business in a way Evelyn never did. Evelyn listened. She always did. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, Evelyn stepped into the hallway and made a single call. Grace answered on the first ring. "He signed," Evelyn said quietly. "He moved everything and put her in charge." There was a pause, not surprise, just confirmation. "That means the trust is allowed to review whether he's still honoring the conditions he signed," Grace said. "If he isn't, you can choose whether we keep protecting him." Evelyn closed her eyes, absorbing the weight of it. Protection didn't automatically mean punishment. It meant the option of consequences. She hung up and returned to the bedroom, lying beside a man who had just undermined her in writing, without knowing she was the one his agreements had always been built around. As Daniel slept, secure in decisions he didn't understand, the systems he never knew existed moved from passive protection to active review, quietly, precisely. And somewhere in the layers of contracts and silence, a clock started not automatic punishment, but a countdown to a choice only Evelyn could make. The sound of the door closing echoed too loudly. Daniel had just left for work, confident, distracted, already talking into his phone as he walked away. The lock clicked behind him, and the house fell into a silence so deep it felt heavy. Evelyn Carter stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her hands trembling for the first time in years. This was it, the moment she had been avoiding. She didn't sit down right away. She paced instead, her steps sharp, uneven, like her body was finally releasing everything her mind had been holding back. Her chest tightened, her breath hitched. Then it came. The betrayal didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as grief. Evelyn sank onto the edge of the couch, pressing her hand to her mouth as memories rushed in without warning. She saw herself years ago, sitting in a quiet office late at night, authorizing wire transfers under names no one would ever recognize. Millions moved with a click. No applause, no thanks. She remembered standing at the back of a small conference room during Daniel's first failed pitch. He had been nervous, sweaty, almost defeated. She stayed silent while others dismissed him. That night, she told Grace to approve emergency funding under Miller Advisory's name. She remembered every time Daniel's voice grew louder as his confidence grew every time he interrupted her, dismissed her concerns, called her cautious, and every time she chose silence instead of conflict because she loved him, quietly, completely. Evelyn closed her eyes, allowing the pain to wash through her at last. Not for long, just enough to honor what had been real. Then she stood. The shift was subtle but final. She picked up her phone and called Grace Miller. Grace answered calmly, as always. "I was expecting your call. I don't want emotion involved," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady now. "I want facts." Grace nodded on the other end, already moving. "Then you'll want documentation. If we're going to exercise Clause 14, we need proof of breach, not feeling, evidence." That afternoon, Evelyn met Thomas Reed. Thomas was in his early 40s, plain-looking, forgettable by design. A former compliance investigator who now worked privately, not to expose scandals publicly, but to make them undeniable in court and in boardrooms. "I don't want surveillance for jealousy," Evelyn told him directly. "I want records, timelines, proof that he turned our marriage into a liability and handed control to someone else." Thomas understood immediately. "Clean and legal," he said. "No drama, phone records, messages, meetings, paper only." Over the next days, information arrived quietly. Messages, meeting logs, hotel receipts, call histories that matched Lydia's schedule. Signatures on the restructuring documents placing Lydia in day-to-day control of the new company. Thomas laid it all out clearly. Dates, patterns, intent. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was evidence. Evelyn reviewed everything with precision. No tears, no shaking hands. She treated the betrayal like a business failure, painful but manageable. At night, when the house was quiet, she opened a fresh folder on her laptop. Divorce petition draft. She filled in the details slowly, carefully. Grounds, adultery, timeline. Supported by Thomas's report. She didn't sign it. Not yet. Instead, she paused, her fingers hovering above the screen, remembering the woman she had been when she first chose to trust Daniel. I loved him quietly, she whispered to the empty room. Now I'll end this the same way, Grace called later that evening. The conduct file is complete, Grace said. If you file the petition, the trust will accept it as formal notice of breach. Under the clauses he signed, we're allowed if you wish to withdraw funding and enforce our rights over the secured contracts. Evelyn nodded, even though Grace couldn't see her. No warnings, she said. He signed knowing there were conditions. He chose not to understand them. No warnings, Grace agreed. Once the court stamps your petition and he's served, we'll suspend all new funding and freeze what we control. The notice will go out automatically to his company as a standard funding status update. The plan was clinical, legal, precise. Across town, Daniel sat at his desk, scrolling through emails, smiling at his reflection in the glass window behind his computer. He felt untouchable, certain. The next morning, while he argued with a subcontractor over the phone, his assistant walked in and handed him a thick envelope court-stamped, his name printed across the front. He tossed it onto the desk without opening it. A few minutes later, a new message appeared at the top of his inbox. Subject: Funding status update from Miller Advisory Holdings. Daniel frowned. He clicked it confused, curious, unconcerned. The screen refreshed. And somewhere far away, Evelyn closed her laptop and turned off the lights in her study. The storm had already begun. He just hadn't realized he was standing at the center of it. Daniel Carter hit refresh again, and again. His jaw tightened as the same email stayed on the screen, calm and unmoved by his growing irritation. Subject: Funding status update from Miller Advisory Holdings Body. Effective immediately. All active funding tied to Contract Series A and related facilities has been suspended following invocation of Clause 1 for reversion of authority upon breach. Daniel let out a sharp laugh. Too sharp. This has to be a mistake, he muttered, leaning back in his chair. A system error. He refreshed his inbox a third time. Nothing changed. For years, whenever something went wrong, money arrived. A delay here, a gap there. Somehow, it always fixed itself. He had learned to trust that rhythm. It had never failed him. Until now. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the window. Phone already in his hand, he dialed the finance department. No answer. He was about to try again when the door flew open. Ethan Brooks, the company's chief financial officer, rushed in without knocking. Ethan was in his early 40s, usually calm, always precise. Today, his face was pale, his tie loosened, sweat visible at his hairline. Daniel. Ethan said breathless, "We have a serious problem." Daniel waved him off. "I just got a stupid email from Miller. It's not a glitch," Ethan interrupted, placing a tablet on the desk. "The accounts are frozen." Daniel's smile faded. "What do you mean frozen?" "I mean," Ethan said carefully, "incoming funds from Miller Advisory have stopped. Completely. The revolving facility is locked. Payroll didn't clear this morning, and our automatic payments bounced." Daniel's stomach dropped. "That's impossible," he snapped. "We have reserves." Ethan swallowed. "We did. Those reserves sit in accounts secured under the same master facility. When Miller invoked Clause 14, the bank locked everything tied to them. Compliance flagged us in their system." Daniel stared at him. "Untie them." "We can't," Ethan replied. "Those security documents were signed years ago. The bank won't move without Miller's written consent. I've already tried our relationship manager." The room felt suddenly smaller. Daniel's phone buzzed, a message from a subcontractor. Then another. Then another. "Payment not received. We're pausing work until funds clear. Please advise." Daniel slammed his phone down. "Call them back. Tell them it's being handled." Ethan hesitated. "They've already stopped answering." Word spreads fast when a primary investor freezes funding. Before Daniel could respond, Mark Reynolds stepped into the doorway. Mark's expression wasn't panic, but it wasn't calm either. It was searching. "What's going on?" Mark asked. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. Ethan answered instead. "Funding suspension." Miller pulled the plug. Mark blinked. "Suspension?" Daniel turned sharply. "It's temporary." Mark didn't look convinced. "From who exactly?" "Miller Advisory is just a trustee." "Who's behind them?" Daniel waved a hand. "High net worth family, trust, whatever. We've talked about this. They prefer anonymity. That's how they work. Mark stepped closer. Daniel, every major operation has a primary investor. Someone signs. Someone answers calls. Daniel felt heat rise in his chest. Why does that matter now? Mark didn't raise his voice. Because when money stops, the first question everyone asks is, who do we call? Ethan scrolled on the tablet. I spoke to Miller's office, he said quietly. They wouldn't talk details, confidentiality. But they did say the suspension followed formal notice of breach in the Carter marital estate and restructuring contrary to the spirit of the original agreement. Daniel's breath grew, shallow. What breach? He demanded. There's no detail beyond breach of marital trust and reversion of authority to the original beneficiary, Ethan replied, whatever that means. The phrase hit like a physical blow. Reversion of authority, original beneficiary. Daniel's phone buzzed again, this time with a calendar notification he'd ignored earlier. New event added by Henderson legal subject, urgent divorce petition, funding impact. He'd seen the thick envelope this morning on his desk. Court stamp, his name. He'd shoved it aside, telling himself he'd deal with it after the important stuff. Now the important stuff was collapsing around him. Okay, Daniel said, forcing calm. We'll bridge this. Short-term loan, emergency line of credit. We have contracts on the books. Ethan shook his head. We already tried. The bank refused without written comfort from Miller. And once a major fund formally invokes a conduct clause, every lender gets nervous. Daniel's breath turned ragged. This doesn't make sense, he said. Nothing like this has ever happened. Mark studied him. Exactly. Silence filled the room. Daniel looked around at the desk he had fought for, the office that symbolized his rise. For the first time, it all felt fragile. Ethan cleared his throat. We need a plan. Staff are asking questions. Subcontractors are threatening legal action. And if Miller doesn't change their position, we can't pay anyone in a matter of days. Daniel stared at the email on his screen again. Clause 1-4 reversion of authority upon breach. Status. Invoked. Funding authority reverted to original trust beneficiary. He had signed that clause years ago. He had reaffirmed it when Lydia pushed the restructure. He'd never bothered to ask who that original trust beneficiary was. His phone vibrated sharply. Lydia. Relief surged through him. He grabbed the phone and stepped into the hallway as he dialed back. The call rang. Once, twice. Then went to voicemail. Daniel stopped walking. He tried again. Straight to voicemail. A knot tightened in his chest. Mark watched from the doorway, his face unreadable. She's your consultant, right? He asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer. Behind him, his office door remained open, the sound of worried voices spilling out. For the first time in years, nothing moved to save him. No money, no approvals. No silent solution. Somewhere far away, the trust Evelyn had built had already shifted. The protection was gone. The consequences were catching up. Daniel stared down at his phone. Schedule a meeting with Lydia, he told his assistant hoarsely. Now. In the next moment, he would realize that the woman he'd chosen over his wife had already calculated the risk and decided he wasn't worth it. Daniel Carter pushed through the glass doors too fast. They swung back behind him with a sharp snap that echoed through the quiet cafe lobby. His heart was racing, his phone clenched tightly in his hand, his mind scrambling for control that had slipped away hours ago. He spotted Lydia more immediately. She was already seated at a corner table, posture straight, coat still on, phone face down beside her coffee. She didn't look surprised to see him. She didn't even stand. That was the first warning. Daniel crossed the room quickly and dropped into the chair across from her. Thank God, he said, forcing a smile. I've been calling you. Lydia met his eyes calmly. No warmth, no concern, just calculation. I know, she said. Daniel leaned forward. Something's wrong with the funding. Miller froze everything. Ethan's panicking. Mark's asking questions, but it'll clear. It always does. You said, that's why I'm here, Lydia said, cutting him off gently. The words landed wrong. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? She finally looked away, glancing toward the window. I made some calls this morning. Quiet ones. Daniel's chest tightened. Calls to who? Other investors, Lydia said plainly. People I know from the network. People who don't like uncertainty. Daniel felt heat rush to his face. Why would you do that without talking to me? Lydia looked back at him then, her expression cool. Because I thought you owned the company. The cafe noise faded. Daniel heard only his own breathing. I do, he said quickly. I mean, I run it. That's not what I mean, Lydia replied. I assumed you had full control, full authority, that your main backer would follow you, not the other way around. Daniel swallowed. I do have control. There's just structure, agreements, standard stuff. Lydia's lips pressed into a thin line. I asked around. No one could give me a straight answer on who really controls your funding. The only consistent thing I heard was Miller Advisory and that they've invoked a conduct clause. That's not standard stuff, Daniel. That's toxic. She reached for her phone, tapped once, then slid it back into her coat pocket. That's when I realized something. Daniel leaned in closer. Realize what? That you're not as stable as you made yourself sound. The words cut deeper than he expected. I'm fixing it, Daniel said urgently. This is temporary. I gave up a lot for this. For me? Lydia interrupted softly. Daniel hesitated. For us. For the business. I moved everything into the new company. I made you managing director. I trusted you. Lydia stood slowly, adjusting her coat. You didn't trust me, she said. You needed me. That's different. You came to me because you wanted someone to tell you you'd been right all along. He reached for her hand, desperate now. You said I was wasted potential. You said I deserved more. You pushed me to sign that restructure. I said you had potential, Lydia corrected. I didn't say I'd carry it when the floor fell out. Daniel's voice cracked. You helped me untie the company from Evelyn. Lydia's eyes hardened. No. You tried to untie your company from your marriage on paper. You put me in charge of a structure that depended on money you don't control and never understood. On paper, you signed everything over to me into a system built on someone else's money. You did that yourself. The sentence was calm, final. Daniel stared at her. You're leaving? I already did, Lydia said. She stepped past him without another word. No apology, no hesitation, just exit. Daniel remained seated, stunned, watching her walk toward the door. When it closed behind her, something inside him collapsed. Outside, across the street, Thomas Reed lowered his camera. Thomas stood near a parked car, unremarkable, blending easily into the sidewalk crowd. He took one last photo as Lydia walked away alone, time-stamped, clear, undeniable. Another quiet piece of the record he was building, Daniel shifting loyalty, Lydia stepping out the moment things turned hard. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there for evidence. Daniel stumbled out moments later, eyes unfocused, phone buzzing again in his hand. He barely noticed Thomas as he passed. His phone vibrated sharply. A new notification from his email flagged priority. From Henderson legal subject. Divorce petition filed and served. Immediate attention required. His pulse skipped. He tapped it open with shaking hands. The words appeared slowly on the screen, each one heavier than the last. Carter v. Carter petition for divorce grounds. Adultery and breakdown of marital trust. Attached, evidence bundle and funding disclosure notices. Daniel's breath left him in a single, broken exhale. He looked around the street, suddenly unsure where he was, where to go, who to call. Lydia was gone. The money was gone. And now so was his marriage. Somewhere far away, Evelyn's silence held firm. And in the next moment, Daniel would finally be forced to sit in front of the one person who had always understood the contracts better than he did and read what he had signed. Daniel Carter burst through the door without knocking. Paul! His voice echoed through the quiet office, sharp and uneven, carrying panic he could no longer hide. Paul Henderson, his lawyer, looked up from behind his desk slowly. He was pale more than usual, and that alone made Daniel's stomach twist. Paul was a careful man. He didn't panic. He didn't miss details. If Paul looked worried, something was already wrong. Close the door, Paul said quietly. Daniel did. Hard. What's happening? Daniel demanded. The funding stopped. The company's bleeding. Lydia's gone. And now I've been served divorce papers that mention funding clauses. You told me the restructuring would protect me. Paul didn't respond right away. He stood, walked to a locked cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder. The restructuring did protect someone, Paul said. Just not the person you assumed. Daniel stepped closer. What does that mean? Paul placed the folder on the desk and opened it to a section marked with a small red tab. This, Paul said carefully, is the clause you skipped over. Twice. Daniel clenched his jaw. You said it was standard. It is standard, Paul replied, for private capital that wants control. And it was explained to you when we first signed with Miller Advisory. Daniel's voice rose. Stop talking in circles. Paul turned the folder toward him. Clause 14. Read the heading. Daniel stared at the dense text, legal language blurring together as he searched for the bold line. Clause 14. Reversion of authority upon breach of marital trust. His throat went dry. Paul spoke slowly now, each word deliberate. Years ago, when you were desperate for funding, the primary investment came from a blind trust. Miller Advisory was the trustee. You were told at the time that the beneficial owner wished to remain private. Daniel shook his head. I don't remember that. I walked you through it, Paul said quietly. You signed anyway. You needed the money. Daniel's breathing grew shallow. Why is this about my marriage? Because the beneficial owner insisted on this condition, Paul said. If the primary beneficiary of the funded company, meaning you committed a serious breach of marital trust and their spouse chose to act on it, the investor's trust could withdraw funding and take control of the secured assets. You reaffirmed that condition when we did the restructure with Lydia. Paul flipped the page. The trust has now received a court-stamped divorce petition, he continued, with evidence attached. That legally confirms the breach they needed. Once that happened, they invoked Clause 14. Funding authority reverted to the original source. Daniel stared at the paragraph halfway down the document. Trigger activated. Formal notice received Carter marital estate. Status. Authority transferred to original trust beneficiary. Daniel's lips parted. His voice came out hoarse. Who is the original source? Paul hesitated. Daniel slammed his palm on the desk. Who? Paul exhaled, then reached for another folder, a slimmer one, sealed with a label that, until now, Daniel had never seen. Up until this morning, I was bound by confidentiality, Paul said. The trust released that restriction today, at the request of the beneficial owner. He removed the seal, opened the folder, and turned it toward Daniel. A single line sat in the center of the page, beneficiary of funding authority and reversion rights, Evelyn Carter. The room went silent. Daniel felt his legs weaken. He gripped the edge of the desk to stay upright, staring at the name like it might disappear if he blinked. My wife, he whispered. My wife funded everything? Paul didn't answer. He didn't need to. Daniel's mind raced backward through years of memories, contracts that never failed, investors who appeared at the last second, money that always arrived without explanation. Evelyn's quiet questions, her insistence on protection, her refusal to combine finances, her connection to Grace, the trustee he'd always treated as a distant banker. She knew, Daniel said hoarsely. She knew all along. Paul nodded slightly. The clause wasn't added recently. It was there from the beginning, before your company ever took off. Her trust backed you on the condition that if you turned your marriage into a liability, she wouldn't be forced to keep protecting you. Daniel shook his head in disbelief. Then why didn't I know? Because you never asked, Paul said gently. About the investor. About why such a specific condition was in there. You were in a hurry. You signed what you were told to sign. Daniel sank into the chair behind him, the weight of it crushing. He covered his face with his hands, a sharp sound escaping his chest, half laugh, half gasp. All this time, he murmured, I thought I built it. Paul closed the folder slowly. You built the front. She built the foundation. Daniel looked up suddenly. Can we undo it? Paul's expression hardened. No. Appeal it? No. The trust executed its rights under the contract, cleanly. The bank and regulators will back them. Negotiate? Paul shook his head again. The only person who could change anything now is the beneficial owner, and she has chosen not to. She's instructed the trust to enforce its rights and step away from you personally. Daniel stared at the desk, at the neat stack of papers that now felt like weapons. She didn't confront me, he said softly. No, Paul agreed. She didn't have to. Daniel's eyes drifted back to the folder. Something else caught his attention, something he hadn't noticed before. A signature, careful, precise, unshaken. Evelyn Carter. The date was years old. From long before Lydia, before the company, before Daniel believed he was untouchable. Daniel's chest tightened as the truth finally settled. This wasn't revenge thrown together in anger. This was preparation for the exact kind of man he had chosen to become. And in the next moment, Daniel would discover that the consequences of that preparation were not just private, they were about to become part of the public record. The courtroom doors closed with a heavy thud that echoed through Daniel Carter's chest. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. Footsteps, papers shifting, a quiet cough from the back row. Daniel sat stiffly at the respondent's table, his hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Across the room, Evelyn Carter sat upright beside her lawyer, calm and composed. She did not look at Daniel. That hurt more than anger ever could. The judge, an older man with a firm expression and tired eyes, entered and took his seat. The room fell instantly silent. "Let's proceed," the judge said. Evelyn's lawyer, Daniel Wright, stood. He was in his early 50s, measured, deliberate, known for never raising his voice. He didn't need to. His confidence came from preparation, not performance. "This court has been presented with a clear sequence of events," Wright began. As he spoke, documents appeared on the screen behind him. Funding trails, contracts, time-stamped approvals, digital signatures, photographs taken by Thomas Reed, message logs showing Lydia and Daniel's pattern over months. The evidence unfolded slowly, carefully, like a story Daniel no longer recognized as his own. Wright pointed to the screen. The petitioner, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, inherited substantial assets which were placed into blind trusts, administered by Miller Advisory Holdings. Years before this marriage began to deteriorate, those trusts provided funding to Mr. Carter's company through secured facilities. He clicked to the next slide. The facilities included a conduct clause and reversion rights. These were reviewed with Mr. Carter at the time and confirmed again when he elected to restructure his company and install Miss Lydia Moore as managing director. Wright didn't look at Daniel when he said Lydia's name. He didn't need to. Following evidence of an extramarital relationship, Wright continued, Mrs. Carter chose to file for divorce. At that point, the trust, under its existing rights, withdrew funding and assumed control of the assets it had always legally secured. Mark Reynolds sat several rows back, his face tight. He had already testified briefly, confirming Daniel's increasingly reckless decisions, Lydia's influence, and the moment they discovered Miller's suspension, Thomas's compiled records had been submitted as exhibits clean, legal, unemotional. When Wright finished presenting the financial structure, Paul stood to confirm on the record that Daniel had indeed been advised of the clauses, even if he chose not to pay attention at the time. Daniel felt the eyes in the room shift toward him. Affair records followed. Hotel invoices. Overlapping meetings with Lydia. Messages that no longer sounded innocent when pinned to dates and times. Daniel swallowed hard. Wright's tone never changed. The petitioner is not seeking punitive damages against Mr. Carter, he said calmly. She is simply asking this court to recognize the agreements already in place, the validity of the trust, the prenuptial structure, and her right not to continue shielding a man who used her money to build a life that excluded her. When Wright sat, Daniel shot to his feet. "This isn't fair," Daniel blurted out. "I didn't know." The judge raised a hand sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Carter." Daniel froze, then lowered himself slowly back into the chair, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. Evelyn never moved. She never defended herself. She never accused him. She never spoke at all. Her silence carried more weight than any argument. The judge reviewed the documents one last time, then looked up. "The court finds no evidence of coercion or fraud in the agreements the parties entered into," the judge said evenly. Mr. Carter signed the original funding documents and subsequent restructuring on advice of counsel. He had the opportunity to understand what he was agreeing to. Daniel's chest tightened. The court therefore recognizes the validity of the trust structure and the reversion of authority as exercised by Miller Advisory on behalf of Mrs. Carter. The judge continued. Any corporate consequences arising from that reversion, such as Mr. Carter's removal from leadership roles, are a matter for the company's governance and not this court. A murmur rippled through the observers. In the matter of Carter v. Carter, the judge said, divorce is granted on the grounds presented. The marital estate is divided in line with the prenuptial agreement and the existing trust structure. Mr. Carter retains personal assets not secured under the trust. Mrs. Carter retains what was always legally hers. The judge set down his papers. This matter is concluded. The gavel struck once. Final. Daniel stood slowly, his legs unsteady. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as people began to rise. But all he could see was Evelyn. She finally looked at him. Just once. There was no anger in her eyes. No satisfaction, no sorrow, only distance. The kind that could never be crossed again. Daniel took a step toward her before he realized what he was doing. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, I didn't know." For a moment, it looked like she might respond. Then Evelyn stood. She gathered her papers calmly, nodded once to her lawyer, and turned away. Daniel remained frozen where he stood, watching her walk toward the exit without looking back. As she reached the door, Evelyn paused not for him, but for herself. Behind her, Daniel's future lay in ruins, built on money he'd never bothered to understand. Ahead of her, something else waited, and in the next moment, Evelyn would decide what, if anything, was left to say to herself. The silence hit harder than the courtroom ever did. Evelyn Carter closed the door behind her, the sound soft but final. The house felt different now, not empty, not heavy, just still. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm has already passed. She stood there for a moment, breathing evenly, as if checking herself for damage. There was none. Her phone buzzed once, then stopped. No more alerts from the trust, no more updates from lawyers, no more dashboards demanding constant attention. For the first time in months, everything was quiet because it was finished, not because it was waiting. Evelyn walked into her study, where sunlight fell across a clean desk. No clutter, no trophies, just space. She sat down, opened a thin folder, and slid out a stack of documents. New plans, new investments, new beginnings. Miller Advisory would continue operating. The trust would keep investing, but into projects and people she believed in, without the burden of protecting someone who had treated her like background. She wasn't tearing anything down anymore. She was rebuilding. A knock came at the door. Grace Miller stepped inside, calm as ever. Her posture hadn't changed. Her expression hadn't shifted. She had always been steady before the betrayal, during the collapse, and now after everything was done. Grace took a seat across from Evelyn. "Everything's finalized," she said. "The transfer of control is complete. The board at Carter Strategic Projects Limited has already voted to remove Daniel. The trust holds the secured assets, no loose ends." Evelyn nodded. She signed the last page and handed it back without hesitation. Grace studied her for a moment. "You're handling this well," Evelyn gave a small smile. "I prepared for a long time." Grace hesitated, then asked the question she had been holding back. "Do you regret not telling him who you were from the start?" The room was quiet again. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, watching the light shift slowly across the floor. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, calm, older, wiser. "No," Evelyn said finally. "I regret that he never asked. Not once. Not about the investor, not about why I understood those contracts, not about why I stayed separate." Grace nodded. She understood. They sat in silence for a few moments longer. Not uncomfortable, not sad, just complete. When Grace stood to leave, she paused at the door. "What will you do now?" Evelyn closed the folder. "Live honestly, quietly, on my own terms, and choose people who ask real questions before they sign things." Grace smiled once, then left. Evelyn stood and walked through the house, touching nothing, needing nothing. The past didn't follow her. It stayed where it belonged. At the front door, she stopped and looked back one last time, not with longing, but with clarity. Daniel had thought success came from confidence. He had thought it came from being loud, admired, desired. He never realized it came from loyalty. He never understood that the loudest applause in his life had been funded by the quietest person in the room. And when he erased the one person who protected him, the truth simply stopped protecting him too. Evelyn stepped outside. The door closed behind her. She walked forward, unbothered, unchased, undefeated. Somewhere across the city, a man sat in a much smaller office, staring at a single, unpaid invoice on an empty desk. No trust behind him. No safety net. No wife quietly calling in favors. For the first time in his career, if Daniel Carter wanted to build something, he would have to do it without erasing the person who made it possible. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next video.